I'll be honest, Ben, when I first started as an appraiser in the late 90s, I worked in an office and my next door neighbor was an underwriter. And he told me, don't ever mark the box rural. It'll kill a deal.
I remember those days, yeah. I think they probably loosened up on that a little bit because after 08, 09 and everything crashed, lending, that whole business model looks different. I don't feel like we see that as much anymore because we mark stuff rural all the time. And the thing is, we're going to mark stuff rural, especially if we've got a comparable sale that's 10 miles away. Part of it, I think appraisers, residential appraisers too, you're looking at the page one of the URAR and you only have a little small section that you can describe your neighborhood. And they're used to that because they're appraising in subdivisions in cities.
When we think of America, we think often of our big cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco. And as you know, both Tonya and I work as appraisers in dense urban markets. But the reality is rural America makes up 97% of the country's landmass. About 60 million people, or 1 in 5 residents, live in rural America. And yet there's a lack of appraisers to serve these markets.
Warren, did you know that rural appraisers have to consider things like mineral rights? They need to assess acreages, what can be done on the land, if there's any tax incentives for properties, whether there's sewer or septic required for development. There's a lot more that goes into rural appraising than we thought of.
I did not know that, or I should say, I do know that, but I don't know how to do that. So that's why we have our wonderful guest here today.
And we're excited to welcome Ben Davidson here to our podcast. Ben, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey guys, so my name is Ben Davidson and I have been an appraiser for 27 years, do a lot with AI, but I am primarily what I would call a generalist appraiser. I'm a certified general appraiser, but I do all property types because I pretty much focus on the rural areas. And I've been appraising since 1997. I started in Kentucky, which is why I sound like I do, and with my accent. But I moved to Colorado almost 13 years ago. And, when I started in Kentucky, you had to learn to do it all, as Warren said, because there wasn't enough appraisers in the rural areas. Didn't realize what a blessing that would be when we moved to Colorado. I set myself in the mountains outside of Denver, up in Conifer. It's about 9,000 feet above elevation. And I became the mountain appraiser and the rural appraiser and the ranch appraiser and anything and everything in between. So I do have all 4 designations with the Appraisal Institute. Not that I ever set out to get all 4. It's just when you are in a rural market and you have to learn to appraise everything, then you kind of check the boxes on being able to obtain those designations from the experience standpoint.
Ben, interesting that you say that you moved to the mountains and you also used the word rural. I think a lot of people, when they think immediately of rural, like myself, I think of pastoral, acreage, the plains, but mountains are also rural too, correct?
Right. Well, and I think what you look at, if you had to define rural, whether it's in Kentucky, whether it's in New York, whether it's in Colorado, I think one thing that you think about is that I've got my city centers, right? I've got in Colorado, we're going to have Denver. You're going to move south into Colorado Springs. You keep going along 25, you're going to catch the different cities everywhere from Pueblo to Fort Collins in the north. What happens is I think when you push out of those areas, whether it's on the plains going towards Kansas or whether it's going west into the Rocky Mountains, is that when those population densities, when you see the population start to decrease and you see the distance between properties start to increase. And sometimes it's just looking at nature, whether it's a rural mountain or whether it's a pasture, or it's just when you get out of those city centers, that's to me what rural appraising is. That's what the rural areas are. And they're all across the country. Rural in Kentucky looks like the same way. You push out of Lexington, you push out of Louisville. I'm sure, Tonya, with you, rural is a ways away from New York City, I would imagine. You're more of that urban, to where sometimes in the smaller communities you would call that suburban, and then when you push out that in the lower areas would be rural. Like, most of all of Wyoming, because we appraise in Wyoming as well, is basically you can say that's a rural state except for about 3 spots, just because it's so desolate and so spread out.
How far apart do the homes have to be in a rural setting?
That's a good question. I think that can change based on location. If you can still see your neighbor, but now I have such a commute to get to my groceries, a commute to get to my schools, a commute. And that all plays into that. So it's not just how close your houses are together to be rural. It's also how close are you to the city centers? How close are you to employment? How close are you to schools, shopping, all that kind of stuff?
I'll be honest, Ben, when I first started as an appraiser in the late 90s, I worked in an office and my next door neighbor was an underwriter. And he told me, don't ever mark the box rural. It'll kill a deal. Yeah.
I remember those days. Yeah. I think too, I think they've probably loosened up on that a little bit, because I think after 08, 09 and everything crashed, lending, that whole business model looks different, of course. I don't feel like we see that as much anymore because we mark stuff rural all the time. And the thing is, we're going to mark stuff rural, especially if we've got a comparable sale that's 10 miles away, right? That's just going to make sense that that's a rural location. And then we also, part of it, I think appraisers, residential appraisers too, you're looking at the page 1 of the URAR and you only have a little small section that you can describe your neighborhood. And they're used to that because they're appraising in subdivisions and cities. So what you have to do in a rural market is that you have to expand into your supplemental addendum. And you have to talk about that neighborhood on a broader scale. Your neighborhood now might be an entire county. Your neighborhood might be a 10-mile radius, something like that, to where you're helping the person understand why you mark this rural. So one thing that I wanted to touch on that we have to be careful about is when we talk about appraising rural, and I want to focus on appraising rural residential. So this is to the residential guys, is that right now you're slow. And I know you're slow because I've talked to you. And so what's happening is you're expanding out of your normal comfort zones to get into the rural areas. And the rural areas have their own nuances to them. And primarily what you have to ask yourself is, as a certified residential appraiser, when you get an order in a rural area, can you appraise it? And so it all comes down to highest and best use. And the thing is, we know that we check a box on page 1 of the URAR. USPAP says that you have to summarize that highest and best use. I get that you can do a real small one for a subdivision, but when you get into the rural, you start to really have to do the test, because if you don't, it will determine or not is the highest and best use truly a residential property. So I'll give you an example. So, in a lot of, this will happen all the way across America, is that you'll have a main street in a little small town. They built houses 100 years ago, right? Now those houses are starting to convert to accounting offices, law offices, but then you still have, the homeowner, and then there's another, some type of commercial user, then a homeowner, then a commercial user. But then what you got to check is that a lot of these small towns, to try to do growth, have made that whole Main Street corridor commercial, but there's still a big dominating presence of residential users, and they're just changing these houses out. Well, when you start your highest and best use as a residential appraiser, and you see that's, you can't just check the box, because the first question is going to be what's legally permissible. And you're going to say, oh, it's commercial zoned, right? So now you have to then say, okay, what's my final test is to see what's maximally productive to this site. Is it a commercial use or is it a residential use? You're going to have to defend why it's a residential use in a commercial zone, right? And you can do it. And as long as your highest and best use says this is a continuation of a residential use, then you're golden. Appraise it. But if you get to where you test it and it starts to seem that everything's moving to commercial, you expect it to go to commercial, and the commercial properties are getting a higher price, let's say per square foot. Well, now you're going to appraise it wrong if you appraise as residential. And then if you come to the conclusion that it's commercial, you have to stop the assignment because your license doesn't cover it. We've seen that happen. We've seen people go to the board before that because of that, all because they checked a box. And just because somebody was living in the house. The other thing is too that you have to worry about is that the AMCs, they don't know or they don't care. They see a house, they send it to you, say put on a 1004. Well, in a rural area, you have to start checking what's going on. And just because the AMC said do it doesn't mean that you can do it. And sometimes the AMC doesn't know what they're ordering it. And the residential appraiser is trusting that they know what they're allowed to do, what they're allowed to order.
Ben, would you say that a good rule of thumb for a residential appraiser that shows up to a property that they're assuming to be residential was ordered residential. If there's any thought that there's income production going on, any kind of business based on the property, is that a good indicator that maybe that assignment is not for them, or they're needing to really dig deeper into the highest and best use?
Oh, for sure. And so here's another example that we're seeing, and I know we're seeing this all across the country because the AMCs are ordering this way. We got an order this week, a bid, and it went out because when I taught this class, I talked to some different people that also saw bids like this. And so the AMC sent it over and said 1004, that's what the form they want, residential refinance, gave us the address, and in the comments said, please note this has a commercial equine operation system on site. A lot of times what you'll see is they'll have the stables, and then from the stables, they'll have an indoor riding arena. And so what they're doing is they're renting out monthly stables. And let's say it's anywhere from $400 to $600 a month just to keep your horse. Then you can book riding time. You can book feedings. There's all kinds of things that you can do. But what happens is typically you have a caretaker or an owner that has a house on site. So the AMCs, and they sent it to us like that. And so to every residential appraiser that saw that, immediately you should have looked that up. And when I did, and when you saw how big the operation was from the equine center, the house doesn't really contribute value. That right there tells you shouldn't do it. Now, one thing I know is, and I didn't even bid on it because what will happen is, unfortunately, this is one reason I'm trying to let people know to check that you can do this. Somebody will bid it because it has a house on it. And an AMC said it has a house on it, so therefore you can do it. That's wrong. And that's going to get you in trouble. If you go do that property and it's an income producing property, you got to do your highest and best use. And I've been asked before that say, well, being more residential appraisers, we don't know how to do a highest and best use to determine if it's commercial. There's the conundrum, right? So if you pull up on something, Warren, like you're saying, let's say we pull up on a house in 20 acres, right? But all of a sudden it's got this huge equine facility on it. And there's everybody coming and going. There's horses everywhere. There's people riding. That should be a real red flag for you to say, you know what? I'm going to have to let this one pass.
Do you often have to retain engineers to help you with the analysis for highest and best use?
No, not typically. When you do a lot of that's kind of probably more, Tony, from the commercial standpoint. In the residential stuff, we're not going to see that much. We hope to have a survey, which would be great. An ILC, that would be a survey here. If you've got engineered building plans, you can never have enough information. Now, that's one thing you could look at. So if somebody has an engineer's report, even in the residential, ask for it and look at it. And that way you'll kind of understand what the quality is, construction is, that kind of thing.
So I'm not understanding one thing. If you have 160 acres, why can't you subdivide it? What makes it only a single family residential lot?
Okay. So if we're looking at the test, let's go on 160 acres of flat agriculture ground. Okay. And let's say it's close to a small community. Now, there's a good chance that you might be able to subdivide that into 35-acre parcels, okay? If you do that and you subdivide it into 34-acre parcels, if you look at what a certified residential appraiser says, it says can do 1 to 4 family purposes, but does not, this is talking about vacant land, but does not include land for which a subdivision analysis is necessary. So you can't appraise it. So if you think it's going to be able to subdivide as a residential appraiser, you're out. You're done. So that would play into your highest and best use analysis. That's what we're looking at from the standpoint of flat ground in the plains. But also out there, you may have someone that says, hey, that's great soil quality.
Sorry, I was going to ask what that was.
I saw the look on your face.
Soil?
Well, he's got some soul.
Okay, got it. Soil.
So when you look at the soils, your neighbor might say, hey, that's great for corn or wheat production. I'd love to buy that 160 acres and use it for an agriculture purpose. I don't want it for a house. And the thing is, and you'll see it in a price per acre on what that'll do. If it has water, it changes on a price per acre. I saw a gentleman one time in Colorado. We appraised it. He had 800 acres that was dry ground in southeast Colorado. And at that time, it was worth about $400 an acre. He buys it, and I saw him trade it for $800 or sell it for $800 an acre the next week. And all he did is figure out, he bought it from somebody that could not figure out how to get the water to it. In the process of why he was buying it, he figured out how to get water to it. And when he did, it doubled the price.
Okay.
So that's the things that you have to think about if you are a residential appraiser and you run across something that says I have water rights. Now, you take Kentucky. Kentucky has so much water that nobody cares, right? We're not worried about where we get our water and who's got ownership of the water. But when you get to the West and you get to areas like Colorado, water is liquid gold. People will ask me, hey, when does Colorado stop growing? And it stops growing when the water tells us it stops growing, because at some point in time, the water won't support us.
You have to
And
explain to
you
me
can
what
trade
this
water.
means. To
So
me,
you can
what
trade
water
water
rights
on a
are.
deed. So you don't have to worry about it where you're at in New York, right? Out here, you buy and sell water. So one thing that we're seeing is some of the municipalities in their 25-year, 50-year, 75-year comprehensive plan for growth, they're buying ranches that have water rights with them. And what they'll do is they'll then absorb the water right. They've got the deed to the water right. They've got the deed to a certain amount of water. And then they dry up the ground, and then they turn around and they sell the ground back off. The ground gets sold at a discount because there's no more water with it. What they're doing is they're then leasing the water back to that ranch until they need it. So they're planning for that, because if you run out of water, then you stop growing. And so there's only so much water that goes around, and you own it by deed. And of course, you also own it by whether it's a senior right, whether it's a junior right. When did you buy water? There's water court, water attorneys, water engineers, water appraisers, all in Colorado.
Where do they put the
Where do they
water?
put the water?
Well, you're saying
Where do they
they
put it?
dry it, right? The county comes and dries the land. Where do they put the water? Sorry, now you're making me say it the way you do.
So what happens is they'll come in and they can pull the water. They can pull so much water that they want. And so like they'll build reservoirs to hold this water. And sometimes they just keep letting it flow, and it goes back to the land until they need it. They just have the right to use it when they need it. And so that's why you'll see these cities buying it, because if they don't have a 50-year idea where the water's coming from, then they have to stop growing.
Warren,
Does that
I
help?
don't know about you, but I'm shocked. This is all new to me. Had no idea this was happening.
I'm very glad that that's the case, because I've been on the other side, Ben, where we've been in some commercial discussion and I just sit there and say, wow, you guys are speaking another language. So, but I'll have to admit, you're kind of speaking another language to me too, because I am going to stick with my course of action, which is big, tall buildings split up into small condos. And every time somebody wants something rural done, I give them Ben's number, because this is super interesting, but not for me.
So aside from the water issue, how do these rural developments, how are they affected by utilities or lack of utilities?
That's going to depend on, so let's go to the mountains, and let's go down in Park County near Hartselle. Okay. That little area in that mountain town down there is all off grid, right? So, and we're talking off grid, it's solar. You have a well, which is typical. You have a septic system, but they don't have electricity. Everything works off solar and batteries. Everybody uses that. And so when you're appraising that down there, it's typical to the market. So therefore the sales will reflect how the utilities are looked on upon that. When you come to other areas outside of Denver, outside of Colorado Springs, Fort Collins, any of the cities along 25, most all of your utilities are well and septic, and that's typical. And ideally, if you're going to have a well, you want to be in the mountains, because that's the best water there is. My well I was at 9,000 feet when we moved out here, and that I don't know that I've had water ever better than fresh mountain water runoff to my well. But from that standpoint, Tony, it's all going to be based on how the market reacts to it. People like to have city utilities, but in the rural areas, you don't necessarily have that. And so it's just common not to have it. So nobody really worries about it. And your sales will reflect that. And, because if you have a well and you have a septic, then you don't have a water or a sewer bill. So there's the trade-off a little bit. You dig the well, you put the septic in, and you no longer have those utility expenses, because that's how that operates. You have the electricity expense, of course.
So the well has nothing to do with your water rights, right? Because the well takes rainwater or water that comes in and you use that water. The water rights are
No.
water that's underground, or can you explain the difference?
Okay. So a well, they're going to dig down. Sometimes they'll dig as far as 800 feet to find water. Okay. And so different areas, like in Colorado, you have a domestic well, or you have a well that can be used for livestock. You have different well types. Okay. And so the water right typically we all are entitled, if we have acreage, to be able to have a well for a household well. Okay. That's the use. We're not using a ton of water. That comes with buying the lot to build your house on. The water right that you're trying to talk about is more of an agriculture right. Okay. It's a big right that lets me irrigate all my corn, or it lets me water all my cattle, or it lets me have all this water to my acreage, which in turn makes my acreage more productive, which in turn makes my price per acre higher because I have the water. So and I realize you don't understand that because you've never seen that, but a well is still coming from the ground. Okay. A long time, up until about 5 or 6 years ago, because water is so desired in the West, you could not put a 55-gallon bucket under your gutters and keep the water. That was illegal because you didn't own the water.
Even rainwater?
Crazy.
You don't own rainwater?
Nope.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, right? But here's the thing too, because like right now in New York, you guys are getting
We're in a
rain,
drought.
right?
No, we're in a drought.
Okay. I can't tell you the last time it rained at my house. We'll get snow. Now we're about to get hammered in snow, and then the runoff in the spring. But from the standpoint of rain, it hardly ever rains at my house. So we're a very dry climate. So that's where the water is so in demand. And so it's a big deal. There's a lot of people that fight over water. There's a lot of lawsuits over water.
Yeah. I just pulled it up on, my Face Value podcast. A crew here told me this is the first drought New York City has seen in over 20 years.
Wow.
Wildfires in Brooklyn. Prospect Park, Brooklyn had a wildfire.
Well, that's a good question too, which Tony, you don't appraise on a fee simple side or as a fee appraiser, but in New York, would there be an area that somebody would call rural? That's always interests me, from a standpoint of our listeners. I'm giving you an idea of what rural would be here. So what's rural for New York? Like, so where you're at's urban, right? So New York City,
Far
that's
Rockaway.
urban.
Far Rockaway's urban.
Oh, is it? Okay.
How would an appraiser do that? How would that look from an appraiser pushing out?
So in New York City, we call rural anything upstate, but we include Rockland and Westchester County, which are suburbs of the city. So I'd say you'd have to go up to Sullivan County or further north to hit rural. Even west of the city, most of New Jersey is considered suburban, and Pennsylvania. So possibly the Poconos would be rural. I think most of Jersey is suburb, except for when you go further west and south. But we don't really have a lot of rural. We do have a lot of farms up north, like an hour and a half, 2 hours.
New York's a huge agriculture state. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a lot of farms.
People don't think about that. Mm-hmm. People don't think about like New York, California. California is one of the biggest dairy states in the country. Well, and all you think about in California is LA and the beach.
But it makes sense what you're saying, because if you don't have water, right? It rains in New York. We have seasons. Our ground changes. We have, crops that grow really well during summer and spring months. And then during the winter, you have the trees, Christmas trees. There's a lot of Christmas tree farms because people still buy Christmas trees. Yeah. We have a lot of vineyards and a lot of farms, cattle farms, horse farms, like Saratoga Springs is up here. Yeah, and that's one of the biggest, right, next to the Kentucky Derby.
Well, and that's also, you hit on a great point, and this is what you see all the way across the country. So and water will play in this let's use Kentucky. A big farm in Kentucky is going to be about 400 acres, and it's going to be in predominant grass, and they're going to run cattle on it. It's going to be cattle production. Okay, that 400 acres, you can probably get a cow and a half per acre off the grass. They're grazing, they're cutting all summer, and then they're feeding all winter. Okay. Now, that 400 acres, which is big in Kentucky because they've got the water, they got green everywhere. Now, let's go to a dry climate like Colorado. Let's go to the plains. The 360 acres that we'll see sometimes out here for cattle is very small. That's a small ranch. That's a nothing ranch because the lack of water, the lack of grass, what happens is now your animal unit, and it's all of this plays on how the income can produce, right? If I can get one cow per acre in Kentucky, and I can do that on a smaller scale, I'm doing great. Well, in Colorado, that same 1 cow per acre is now 1 cow per 10 acres. So the 400 acres here is really nothing. You need more like 2,000 acres, 2,500 acres, 4,000 acres, right? Sometimes we see, I've appraised the 7,000 acre ranches, the 9,000 acre ranches. And what the water changes all of that. If you had 9,000 acres in Kentucky, that 9,000 acres would be worth so much money, because what you could do with it, to where 9,000 acres in Colorado is still a big spread, but a lot of it's scrub ground that you can't do anything with it.
But you have more, like, Colorado is more of like a tourist destination because you have the snow, you have the lodges. It's like a different, you're taking advantage of your resources differently than some, area in Kentucky would.
That's true.
Yeah.
And the thing about Colorado is, Colorado is, you're talking about the rain. Colorado is super addicting because we get almost 300 days of sunshine a year. People have said that. And so, like, when I lived in Kentucky, Kentucky would go 3 weeks in the winter of gray. You wouldn't see the sun 3 or 4 weeks. And you may not see the sun out here for maybe a day and a half, maybe. If the snowstorms are coming in, you can see them coming. They come in, and then the next thing you know, 4 hours later, the sun's out and the roads are clear 4 hours after that.
Well, I'm gonna go into some pictures that I've seen from Ben on his Facebook posts. Sitting in snow with shorts and like a sweater on, telling us it's 50 degrees and snowing.
Yeah. So here's the funniest one ever. When my kids are grown and gone now, but when we first moved to the mountains at 9,000 feet.
By the way, when I met you, your kids were babies, and I didn't have any.
That's right. Yeah, there you go. We're starting to age just a little. I've got one that's off my payroll. That's what Warren and I were talking about. He graduated college in May.
Oh my gosh.
Doesn't live in the state.
Where did
the
he
other
move
one's
to?
a junior in college. He's in Arkansas. Oh. He's a software engineer for a trucking company in Fort Smith, Arkansas, at the Oklahoma border.
Nice.
And then the youngest one is a junior at University of Alabama. So
nice.
Roll Tide is where he's at. Nobody's close to me. Everybody's 20 hours away. So
you're in the middle of nowhere.
No appraisers either. Both of them.
And no appraisers.
And that's what's crazy is crazy. We have a staff of 5. And my boys, neither one want no anything interest to do with the appraisal business. They think we work too hard. They really think we work.
Are you in the appraiser family? Were your parents, siblings appraisers, or your first generation appraiser?
No. So I'm an anomaly from a standpoint of, if you look at the average age of an appraiser, I'm still a young guy, right?
25 years young.
But from experience, I'm an old guy, right? I'm almost knocking on 30 years of being in this business. And I'm almost 50 years old. So that's what's crazy is that most people did this as second careers. And the thing is, I've got an ag degree. I've got a livestock degree. And I knew I wasn't going to come out and farm. I didn't have the money. So I was trying to figure out how could I keep my ag degree working and still be part of the farms. This was in Kentucky. And that is, that's where I got started. But once you started doing one property type rural, you had to learn to do it all. So we have multiple general appraisers. We do eminent domain. We do commercial. We do residential. We do testimony, court work. I've got a couple of court cases going right now. And all that stems from is because I had to learn to do it all 20 years ago. And if you can learn to do that, and that's what I want to say to residential appraisers, you're having trouble doing the mortgage work. And I get that. It's hard. Our mortgage division died. And so figure out how you can elevate yourself above your peers, and figure out how you can make yourself a specialty in wherever you're at in this country, right? And if you go to the rural areas, just be sure that you are competent to do it. If you're not competent, I'm not saying don't do it. Figure out how to get competent. Call somebody like me, or call somebody that's in your area that's doing that. Call a certified general appraiser that you may be able to help elevate your license. Right? Sometimes people will say, I can't do that because my license won't let me. They'll turn the deal down. Well, maybe you try your best to start finding a certified general in your market that might be willing to sign with you. Right? Therefore, you're not leaving money on the table. You're not leaving opportunity on the table.
I recently hired 3 appraisers, 2 of which were residential. And the reason why I did that as opposed to hiring trainees is they know the fundamentals of appraising. Right. And we can teach them what to do in a commercial appraisal.
That's exactly
I
right.
cannot teach the
Yeah.
fundamentals as easy as it is to change your market type.
Yeah, and that's where we're at, because we're thinking about adding another appraiser. Because there's 5 in our firm, counting me, and we have a staff appraiser in Pueblo, a certified. They're general appraiser in Pueblo, a general appraiser in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a general appraiser in the mountains. I'm here, and then my wife is actually a certified residential appraiser that covers Denver. She doesn't like to, but she does, and she's helping pay for the kids get through college. And I think when the boys are done, she may be done. But one thing that we noticed is that there's still so much opportunity on the western slope, getting over towards Utah, right? And one thing I'm seeing is that I'm thinking right now that I could take on a certified residential appraiser on the western slope who's having a difficult time, and bring them in my organization and teach them what I need them to know, help upgrade their license, and then take advantage of their location, their specialty, their knowledge.
Ben, you talked about the property you appraised that had the ADU. Would that now be considered a barndominium?
No. So barndominium is going to be a construction type. So what typically you're going to have is, and now they're getting fancy with them. What we used to see was you'd have a gentleman he'd buy a big piece of ground, let's say 160 acres, and he would put a big Class S metal building on it, but he would build a bigger building. He may build that thing 60 by 80. And then what he would do is he would finish the front part of that with living space, maybe 20 by 60, give him about 1,200 square feet. And then he had this massive garage that he could work out of. Well, that's Class S construction, typically metal siding. Well, then the craze came into, let's build these barndominiums. They look like barns, but they're basically houses. A true barndominium is going to have about 50% at the top end living area, and the rest of it's going to be like a garage space or a workshop or something like that. They're calling barndominiums now. We're seeing them where they're just building that style, and every bit of it is finished. The style is a barndominium, but it's really a single family house. And the thing is, they used to be inexpensive to build, but now the cost of them are going up because they're doing so many designs with them. Now, if you take a 40 by 60 metal building and you finish half of that cost is going to be fairly cheap. You got $60 a square foot for the metal building, and your finishes can go anywhere between $50 and $100 a foot on top of that, depending on what you do, right? So if you've got a piece of land and you want to come in and do that and live minimally, you can do that, and that's going to be fairly inexpensive. Versus, we did some barndominiums. We do barndominiums all the time. I got the new construction budget on one the other day that was $1 million for a barndominium. And you look at that, and the reason they like them is that, yeah, that price per square foot's a little cheaper, and they're building bigger. So they're getting more for their price per square foot, but you're still spending $1 million because they want to trick them out on the inside, and they want to have that Western look, or they want to have all this craziness with them, and they don't keep them simple like they used to. That's a barndominium. That's what you're seeing the crazy is right now.
So my dream, I guess, would be that barndominium, little kitchenette, place to sleep, bathroom, obviously, 30 treadmills, 30 rowing machines, every weight machine on earth. That's the dream right there.
You're making a gym out of it?
Yeah. So for me though, I'd like to go down somewhere in Colorado, probably towards the mountains. You get down towards Lake George, you get down in Park County, down in there. You can buy 70, 80, 100 acres, right? I would love to buy 100 acres down there and put me a big barndominium down there.
All right, Ben, thank you so much for being here today. I learned so much, but I am afraid I am still going to be an urban downtown guy. So thanks for all the information. But listeners, please go to Spotify and YouTube and subscribe, like. And Tonya, if anyone were to have an idea for another podcast, where might they let us know?
Well, as our listeners have heard, a lot of our podcasts come from friends and family referrals. Please email us at facevalue@appraisalinstitute.org. We will read every email that we receive, and we will make sure to get back to you. Thank you. And Ben, I may take you up on it and come on a site visit to see what a rural appraisal is like one day.
We'll have a great time.
Thank you.